Well, I am just absolutely thrilled about the next speaker. He is extremely well-versed in the ALPA motto, schedule with safety. I know you all know that. That's our motto. He has spent most of his career focused on transportation safety. And today, Chris Hart is the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, a position he's held for over 2 years now. He's actually served on the board twice, this stint since 2009 and back in the early 90s, before moving on to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Chris is very familiar with aviation. He's a licensed pilot with commercial, multi-engine, and instrument ratings, and his family has a tradition of accomplishment in the field as well. In 1926, his great-uncle, James Herman Banning, became the first African-American pilot to receive his pilot license by the United States government. So, yep. Please, a warm welcome for Chairman Chris Hart.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Captain DePete, for that kind introduction. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I warned Captain and Captain Knoll that their number one danger when they get me up here is getting me to shut up because I'm an attorney. And that means my number one credo is never use one word when two will suffice. But I will do my very best. So thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks to ALPA for inviting me to speak on behalf of the NTSB today. I think most of you know, but I'll say it anyway, that the NTSB investigates accidents in transportation, determines what caused those accidents, and then makes recommendations to prevent those accidents from happening again. So my remarks today come from the context of what we see as accident investigators. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is automation. The good news is there's more automation. The bad news is there's more automation. Airline pilots have a long history of transitioning to more and more automated operations. In fact, according to a 2015 article in the New York Times, Boeing 777 pilots reported that they spent just 7 minutes manually piloting their planes in a typical flight, and Airbus pilots spent half that time. So experience has shown that automation can improve not only safety, but also reliability and productivity and efficiency, but the problem is there is also a downside. All of you know firsthand that automation is becoming more prevalent in flight operations, yet human pilots are still crucial to the process. To determine why that is, it's instructive to explore both the theory of full automation and the present state of increasing but not complete automation. Completely manual operation is unambiguous, and completely automated operation is also unambiguous because in both instances it's very clear who's in charge. When the automation is combined with human operators, however, it's not always so clear who's in charge, and that's where things can get complicated. The theory of automation in the flight deck is that if there's no pilot, there will be no pilot error. Removing the pilot would also address at least 4 human-based issues on the NTSB's most wanted list of transportation safety issues: fatigue, distraction, impairment, and medical fitness for duty. But unfortunately, this theory of removing pilot error by removing the pilot has several defects. The first defect is that the theory assumes that the automation is working as designed. But what if the automation fails? Will it fail in a way that is safe? If it can't be guaranteed to fail in a way that's safe, will it inform the pilot of the failure in a timely manner? And will the pilot then be able to take over successfully? The fatal metro accident that occurred here in Washington in 2009 resulted from a failure of the automation that the operator was unaware of until it was too late. Another defect is that the theory fails to address what happens when the automation encounters unanticipated situations. If the automated system's knowledge is only as complete as its programming, and the situation has never been encountered before or wasn't imagined by the programmer, then the automation may not be able to respond appropriately. Last but not least, removing the pilot doesn't remove other sources of human error from the system. Humans are still involved in designing, manufacturing, and maintaining the aircraft, and human error in these steps is likely to be more systemic in its effect, possibly involving several aircraft, and more difficult to find and correct. For example, we investigated a collision of a driverless airport people mover that resulted in part from improper maintenance. So they took the driver error out, but it still crashed. Beyond designing, manufacturing, and maintaining the aircraft, humans are also involved in the system in other ways. For example, the pilots in other airplanes, the air traffic controllers, airport personnel who are involved in functions such as wildlife hazard mitigation and clearing contaminated runways. So each of these points of human engagement presents additional opportunities for human error. But the most fundamental lesson that we have learned from our accident investigation experience is that introducing automation into complex human-centric systems can be very challenging. The problems that we have seen thus far from increasing automation include increasing complexity, degradation of skills, complacency, and potential loss of professionalism. For example, in the 2013 crash of Asiana Flight 214 in San Francisco, the pilots had become confused by the behavior of the airplane's automated systems when used in various modes. The pilot's mode selection caused the auto throttles to disengage, and the pilot incorrectly assumed that the auto throttles would wake up and maintain the desired speed. As a result, Asiana 214 came in low and slow and crashed into a seawall while landing. Excuse me. This crash illustrated not only confusion attributable to the complexity of the automation, but also the degradation of the pilot's skills to the extent that he was unable to complete a manual approach and landing on an 11,000-foot PAPI-equipped runway on a clear day with negligible wind. What's wrong with that picture? Asiana's automation policy emphasized the full use of all automation and did not encourage manual flight during line operations. In addition to automation confusion and de-skilling, our investigation experience has shown that the challenge of complacency can arise when human pilots operate aircraft with more automation and with increasingly reliable automation. Complacency is particularly insidious because it becomes more pronounced the safer an operation becomes. The more the pilots become accustomed to automation safely operating the airplane, the more concerted effort it takes to keep the pilots engaged. In other words, there can be too much of a good thing. In addition to complacency, query whether too much automation, when it's working properly, can undermine professionalism. An example of this is many subway systems that we have in our country today. Many of them, the system is largely automated so that the automation takes the train out of the station, maintains appropriate speeds, maintains adequate distance from other trains, stops at the next station in the right place, and then opens the doors. So the only thing the operator does is close the doors. It's the only function of the operator, close the doors. So when the operator's only function is to close the doors because everything else is automatic, does the operator love his or her work and enjoy the pride of accomplishment, or will he or she just be there to get a paycheck? If the paycheck is the primary objective, what does that do to professionalism? Unlike the problems that occur when the automation fails, this problem occurs when the automation is performing correctly. Our investigations of automation-related accidents have revealed two extremes. On one hand, the human operator is the least predictable and most unreliable part of the system. On the other hand, the human operator is potentially the most adaptable part of the system when failures occur or unanticipated situations are encountered. One example of the human as the most adaptable part of the system was the crash landing of United Flight 232 in Sioux City, Iowa. As you probably remember, the tail-mounted engine failed catastrophically, sending fan rotor parts through all three of the airplane's hydraulic systems. We've all seen that crash as it was filmed through a chain-link fence, and it's truly incredible that without any hydraulics, the pilots were able to use differential thrust of the two remaining engines to maneuver the aircraft to an airport. And very few pilots were subsequently able to do that in the simulator when it wasn't life-threatening, but these pilots did it in real time, and it's even more incredible that more than 60% of the passengers and crew survived that crash. Another example of the human as most adaptable part of the system was Captain Chesley Sullenberger's amazing landing in the Hudson River when his airplane suddenly became a glider because both of its engines were taken out by birds. That flight crew had never been trained to glide an airliner. They'd never been trained to land in the water. They'd never been trained to land without power. Despite that lack of training, Captain Sullenberger and his crew were able to save the day by quickly and calmly assessing the situation, determining that a ditching in the Hudson River was the best course of action, and executing the ditching successfully. Some of you may not be aware that there was an automation aspect to that landing in the Hudson. In order to minimize the vertical impact velocity, Captain Sullenberger had planned to pull the nose up to the upper alpha limit during the flare. Unbeknownst to him, however, the airplane's phugoid damping software stopped his nose-up command 3.5 degrees short of the upper alpha limit. Consequently, the vertical impact speed was higher than it would otherwise have been and the rear fuselage structure was breached to the extent that a flight attendant seated in the rear was injured and water entered the airplane. As a result, automation that was intended to improve safety and comfort actually hindered the most adaptable part of the system, the human pilot. On the other hand, the Colgan crash near Buffalo, New York in 2009 was a case of the human pilot as the most unreliable and unpredictable part of the system. Due to the pilot's inattention and lack of situational awareness, he placed the airplane in a situation that caused the stick shaker and stick pusher to activate, whereupon he responded inappropriately and caused an aerodynamic stall and crash. In fact, so inappropriately that we know from the sensors on that airplane that he was pulling instead of pushing, pulling with 95 pounds of force. FAA records indicated that this pilot had previously received 4 certificate disapprovals, one of which he did not disclose to Colgan, and furthermore, Colgan's training records indicated that while he was a first officer, he needed additional training after 3 separate check rides. How many chances do you have to fail before you shouldn't be in the front of a big airplane? In this instance, the pilot should never have been in the front of a transport airplane, but the filters that are intended to weed out pilots such as him failed. Another textbook example of the human as the most unreliable part of the system was Air France Flight 447 from Rio to Paris in 2009. But in that instance, those pilots were largely set up to fail in a number of ways. After Air France 447 reached its cruise altitude at night over the Atlantic and began approaching distant thunderstorms, the captain left the cockpit for a scheduled rest break, giving control to 2 less experienced pilots. At the ambient temperature and with abundant supercooled water from the nearby thunderstorms, the pitot tube heaters were overwhelmed, which caused the pitot tubes to become clogged, and the airplane lost its airspeed information. The loss of airspeed information caused the autopilot and the auto throttle to fail, and the pilots had to fly the airplane manually. The loss of airspeed information also disabled the alpha protection, so the pilots responded inappropriately to the loss of these systems, stalled the airplane, and crashed into the ocean. Several factors played a role in this crash. To begin with, the 3 pitot tubes did not effectively provide redundancy because they were all taken out by the same cause. In addition, the pilots had not experienced this type of failure before, even in training, and they were unable to figure out in the moment what went wrong. The error messages that the pilots received did not help them determine the cause, which was the blocked pitot tubes, and effect, which was the failed systems that needed airspeed information in order to work. Had the pilots known that the cause of the error messages was loss of airspeed information, they may have known to revert to what we're all trained to do in that situation, which is pitch and power. Crew resource management also failed because the pilot flying did not communicate that he had pulled his stick back, and the pilot monitoring didn't ask. And because the airplane was equipped with side sticks rather than yokes, the pilot monitoring did not know that the pilot flying was pulling back on the stick. Finally, automatic pilots are mandatory at cruise altitudes, as you all know, so the pilots had never flown manually at that altitude before, even in training, even in the simulator, and they had never had any stall recognition or recovery training at cruise altitude. As an aside, the pitot tubes had frozen before in that type of airplane, but the pilots in the previous encounters responded successfully. Consequently, the fleet, including the accident airplane, was scheduled for the installation of more robust heaters, but given the previously successful encounters, an immediate emergency replacement was not considered to be necessary. Increasing automation reduces the workload of the human operator, so when all is going well, automation brings unparalleled safety, reliability, productivity, and efficiency. However, when something goes wrong or something unexpected happens, a human pilot can save the day with much-needed adaptability. The challenge is how to reap the benefits of the automation while minimizing its potential downsides. Let me suggest that one of the best ways to accomplish that goal is through collaboration. For the past 2 decades, the aviation industry has been demonstrating the power of collaboration through the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, or CAST, which you have been participating in actively. Aviation in the U.S. has become amazingly safe. In fact, the last fatal crash of a U.S. airliner was the 2009 Colgan crash that I mentioned before, and the last fatal crash of any airliner in the U.S. was the 2013 crash of Asiana Flight 214. Although automation has played an important role in the industry's continuing safety improvement, much of the industry's exemplary safety record is attributable to collaboration. In the early 1990s, after the industry's accident rate had been declining rapidly, the accident rate began to flatten on a plateau. Meanwhile, the FAA was predicting that the volume of flying would double in the next 15 to 20 years. So the industry became very concerned that if the volume doubled while the accident rate remained the same, the public would see twice as many airplane crashes in the news. And at that point, it doesn't help to go to Joe Public and say, don't worry, the rate is real low. Joe Public counts the number of events. So that caused the industry to do something that, to my knowledge, has never been done before or since in any other industry at an industry-wide level. And that is they pursued a voluntary, collaborative, industry-wide approach to improving safety. This occurred largely because David Hinson, who was then the administrator of the FAA, realized that the way to get off the plateau was not more regulations or a bigger stick for the regulator, but figuring out a better way to improve safety in a very complex aviation system. The voluntary collaborative CAS process brings all of the players, the airlines, the manufacturers, the pilots, the air traffic controllers, and the regulator, all to the table at the same time to do 4 things. First, identify the potential safety issues. Second, prioritize those issues, realizing that they're going to identify more than they have resources to address. Third, solve the problems that they prioritize. And fourth, evaluate whether the interventions are working without causing unintended consequences. This process has been an amazing success. It resulted in a reduction of that aviation fatality rate from the plateau on which it was stuck by more than 80% in less than 10 years. This occurred despite the fact that the plateau was already considered to be exemplary, and many thought that the rate could not decline much further. The process also improved not only safety, but also productivity, which flew in the face of conventional wisdom that improving safety generally hurts productivity. In addition, a major challenge of making improvements in complex systems is the possibility of unintended consequences. Yet, this process generated very few unintended consequences. And last but not least, the success occurred largely without generating any new regulations. What an amazing win-win success story this has been. The moral of this collaboration success story is that everyone who is involved in a problem should be involved in developing the solution. So how is this relevant to automation? It's relevant because collaboration means that the designers of the automation should bring the pilots in during the design phase long before the first human test pilot leaves the ground in a new airplane. Collaboration also means that the regulator should meet with pilots and controllers regularly to obtain operational feedback. In turn, that feedback can be used by the airlines, the flight schools, and the manufacturers to improve their training. It can be used by the manufacturers to improve the design, and by the air traffic controllers to improve operations as appropriate. By embracing this collaborative process, pilots can help industry anticipate and correct problems related to the critical area of interaction between themselves and their automated systems. The ultimate human interface allows the pilot to play his role as the most adaptable part of the system while minimizing the pilot's impact as the most unreliable part of the system. Will airliners ever be completely automated? Fully automated vehicles already exist in some modes, such as airport trams and some subway systems. And we've seen several news stories recently about increasing automation in cars, but accidents such as the landing in the Hudson are the reason why, in my view, we will not see complete automation in airliners anytime soon. Meanwhile, if the industry hopes to continue improving safety, it must continue to enhance its understanding of the human-automation interface through ever better collaboration. So thanks for the opportunity to be here, and if I have time, Captain DePete, to take any questions, I would be more than happy to do that. Thank you for allowing me.